The chamber was still, heavy with the kind of silence that feels rehearsed, as if the marble walls themselves had learned how to hold their breath. At the center of it all sat Mitt Romney, his posture immaculate, his expression carved with the confidence of decades in politics. He tilted his head slightly, raised one eyebrow, and delivered the question like a quiet dagger. "Tell me, Congresswoman, what real experience do you bring to this table?" The words hung, sharp and deliberate, laced with an authority that expected compliance. Around the room, eyes darted. Some smirked, some shifted uncomfortably, but no one spoke. It was the kind of question designed not to seek truth, but to remind her of where she stood, of who he was, the unspoken hierarchy that had ruled these chambers for generations. For a heartbeat, Crockett did not answer. Her silence wasn't weakness, was suspense. Even the cameras seemed to lean closer, capturing the moment of power hanging in the balance. Romney's lips curled just slightly. He had asked this question before to others, in other forms, and more often than not, it ended in retreat. But not this time. What happened next didn't just silence Romney, it sent shockwaves across the nation. Because this wasn't just a question about resume lines or years in office. This was about who gets to belong in the halls of power, who is deemed qualified to speak for America, and who must still justify their very presence. Here was the clash. A man shaped by legacy, insulated by privilege, wielding doubt like a weapon, versus a woman shaped by struggle, sharpened by lived experience, carrying with her the voices of communities rarely heard in these marble rooms. The chambers seemed to sense it that something was shifting. This was not going to be a polite exchange that faded into record-keeping. This was about to become a collision, one that millions watching at home would replay, dissect, share. Romney thought he had set the stage for her to stumble, but Crockett was preparing to take his question and turn it into something far greater. And when she finally spoke, her answer would not just defend her, it would rewrite the balance of power in that room. The setting was not just another hearing. It was a crucible where the country's anxieties and its future collided. The long oak table stretched like a battlefield. Senators lined in their suits and ties, staffers scribbling notes with the urgency of court reporters chronicling history. Cameras whirred softly in the background, their red lights blinking reminders that this was not only for the room, it was for America. Every raised eyebrow, every smirk, every pause and breath was being broadcast to millions who hungered not just for policy, but for drama, for truth, for a sign that their voices could pierce the establishment's walls. At the head of this tableau sat Mitt Romney, polished, seasoned, and commanding, the embodiment of the Senate's old guard. His reputation was built on decades of speeches, campaigns, and backroom negotiations. For many, his very presence carried the weight of experience. For others, it reeked of entitlement. Either way, Romney represented more than himself. He was the figurehead of a political generation that believed it had written the manual on who deserved a seat at the table. Across from him was Jasmine Crockett, younger, sharper, her fire still new to this chamber but already undeniable. She didn't carry the sheen of legacy. She didn't inherit her place here. Every inch of ground she had gained had been fought for with court filings, with late nights in community halls, with a voice that refused to bend to those who told her to wait her turn. In this chamber, her very presence was a challenge, an interruption of the unbroken rhythm of establishment dominance. And so, when Romney leaned back, delivering his question with the casual air of a man who had asked it 1,000 times before, the stakes rose instantly. It was no longer about a resume. It was about whether the old order still held sway or whether a new generation, forged in grassroots struggles and hardened by lived realities, could finally claim its rightful space. For years, questions, like his, had silenced fresh voices. Ambition was often clipped by ridicule, confidence chipped away by the rolling eyes of those who sat higher in the hierarchy. The chamber had a way of training newcomers to shrink, to defer, to accept their place in line, but not today. Today the silence was not submission, it was anticipation. Those watching on television sensed it too. They had tuned in expecting another dry exchange of policy points and partisan quips. but something in the air was different. Viewers leaned closer to their screens, waiting for what would unfold. They didn't know it yet, but they were on the edge of witnessing a moment that would be replayed in headlines, stitched into TikToks, debated on cable news panels, and shared across kitchen tables, because this was not just a senator and a congresswoman sparring. This was a clash of eras, of philosophies, of visions for who America belongs to. One side wielded years of polished authority, the other, the raw authenticity of a voice born from struggle. And in this chamber, where history often feels cemented in marble, the cracks of change were beginning to show. Romney, in that moment, thought he was asserting control, but he was, unknowingly, lighting the fuse of a confrontation that would reverberate far beyond those walls. Viewers at home had no idea they were about to witness history. To understand the gravity of this moment, you have to understand Mitt Romney himself, not just the man who sat across from Jasmine Crockett, eyebrow arched in condescension, but the long shadow of his career that carried him to that seat in the first place. Romney was no stranger to power. He was born into it, raised on the polished etiquette of wealth, educated in the halls where only the elite walked freely. His rise seemed inevitable. Harvard degrees, corporate boardrooms, a governorship, and eventually the national spotlight as the Republican nominee for president. To many Americans, he embodied discipline, order, and the kind of old-school respectability. Politics that claimed to bridge divides, but beneath the polished exterior was a pattern, one that revealed itself again and again, often in subtle moments. Romney, respected though he was, carried himself with the air of someone who expected deference. It wasn't always loud, and it wasn't always cruel. It was quieter than that, a steady undercurrent of entitlement. A dismissive smile here, a skeptical question there, the belief, unspoken but evident, that he had earned his place at the pinnacle of politics. While others, especially those who looked or sounded different from him, still had much to prove, his public image was carefully cultivated, the calm, measured moderate, the man who stood as a bulwark against the excesses of his own party. And to his credit, there were moments when he did break ranks, when he voted his conscience even as his colleagues fell in line. But for all those flashes of independence, Romney's blind spot remained glaring. He had difficulty seeing past his own vantage point of privilege, spoke often of merit, but the merit he recognized most easily resembled his own Ivy League degrees. Corporate pedigrees, legacies wrapped in polished rhetoric. It was this contradiction that made him such a compelling antagonist in the chamber that day. On one hand, he wasn't the snarling caricature of partisan cruelty. He wasn't the loudest voice in the room, nor the most reckless. On the other, his very poise could be just as cutting, because it cloaked a quiet dismissal that could sting, even sharper than a shouted insult. When he questioned Crockett's real experience, it wasn't just about policy expertise. It was the echo of 1,000 moments in American history where the powerful had told the rising, "You are not yet enough." Romney's arrogance wasn't the bluster of a bully, it was the assumption of a gatekeeper. He believed he knew what qualified someone to sit in those chambers, believed his definition of experience, executive office, elite law schools, corporate stewardship was the only valid one. And so, to him, the question seemed almost natural, almost reasonable. What he failed to grasp was that this very reasoning revealed the gap between his world and the one Jasmine Crockett had fought her way through. This is why the exchange carried so much electricity. Romney wasn't just an individual senator throwing shade. He was the living embodiment of entrenched power, a system that smooths the path for some while throwing barricades in front of others. He wasn't evil, he wasn't cruel, but he was blind to the fact that America had shifted under his feet, that new leaders no longer needed his approval to define their worth. Romney believed he was interrogating Crockett from a position of unshakable strength. He underestimated what silence could mean in that moment. Her pause was not hesitation but strategy, a gathering storm. His confidence grew with each second. She remained quiet, his smirk deepening, as though he had cornered her. Yet what he could not see was that silence is sometimes the sharpest blade, one that cuts deepest when it breaks. And so the stage was set. Romney, polished and powerful. A man whose career had been shaped by entitlement hidden beneath civility. Sitting across from a congresswoman forged by struggle and resilience, it was the perfect clash of archetypes. The establishment gatekeeper versus the insurgent truth-teller. Romney wasn't prepared for the fire he was about to unleash. The more he pressed, the more Crockett's silence grew dangerous. Long before Jasmine Crockett walked into that chamber, long before the cameras turned their lenses toward her poised silence, her story was already unfolding in places the powerful rarely look. She was not raised with silver spoons or guarantees. She was raised with grit, persistence, and the understanding that in order to be heard, she would have to speak louder, sharper, and braver than those who dismissed her. Where others inherited their platforms, she built hers with her own hands. Her path to Congress didn't begin in backroom deals or elite prep schools. It began in courtrooms where she stood as an attorney, defending those who had no one else to fight for them. She saw firsthand the inequities that defined America's justice system. She represented clients who couldn't afford the towering costs of legal defense, clients who were told their voices didn't matter, that their futures were already written in the margins. And in those moments, she developed the kind of experience no resume line could capture, the experience of standing between the powerless and the forces aligned against them. Again and again, Crockett was told she wasn't enough. She wasn't connected enough. She wasn't seasoned enough. She wasn't polished enough for the halls of Congress. Those words could have broken someone else. But Crockett learned to turn those dismissals into fuel. She understood something Romney never had to. When you're told you don't belong, you learn to carve belonging out of stone. You learn to transform rejection into resilience. Every slight, every doubt, every smirk from someone who thought they knew better only added to her arsenal. Her journey through grassroots advocacy deepened that resolve. Crockett walked into neighborhoods where the cameras didn't go, where promises of change were little more than sound bites, and she asked what people needed. She fought not from the top down, but from the ground up. And when she eventually ran for office, it wasn't a campaign of entitlement. It was a campaign of necessity. Her candidacy wasn't about building a career ladder. It was about amplifying voices that had been ignored for too long. That difference shaped everything about how she carried herself in Washington. While others calculated every move to climb a political hierarchy, Crockett's loyalty was to the people who had trusted her to fight on their behalf. And that made her dangerous to the establishment. She didn't crave their approval, didn't beg for their validation. She walked into those marble chambers knowing that every time she spoke, she was carrying generations of silenced voices with her. It was that weight and that strength that Romney didn't see when he raised his eyebrow and asked his question. To him, it was a simple challenge, a test of credentials. But to Crockett, it was the embodiment of every "you're not enough" she had ever heard. Every time she had been told to wait her turn, to sit quietly, to prove herself one more time, before being taken seriously. And in that moment, she knew she wasn't just answering Romney. She was answering them all. Her resolve had been forged in the very fires that dismissive questions like his were meant to ignite. She had been underestimated too many times to be rattled now. Instead, she had mastered the art of flipping doubt on its head, turning condescension into her stage. This wasn't the first time a man of status had tried to reduce her worth to bullet points on a resume, and it would not be the last. But Crockett understood the deeper truth. Real experience isn't measured by how many years you've occupied a high office. It's measured by how many years you've stood in the trenches, fighting for those who had no shield but your voice. Romney had spent a lifetime surrounded by colleagues who mirrored his worldview, insulated by privilege that made his authority seem natural. Crockett had spent a lifetime breaking through doors that were never meant to open for her. One path bred entitlement, the other bred endurance. That contrast, privilege versus perseverance, entitlement versus endurance, was about to play out in front of millions, and it would not end the way Romney expected. Because what Crockett carried with her was not just her own story, but the stories of countless others who had been silenced, dismissed, and told they didn't belong. Her answer to Romney would not merely be a defense of her resume. It would be a defense of every person who had ever been questioned, doubted, or underestimated. And so when Romney sneered at her credentials, he didn't know he was triggering the very story she had been waiting to tell. Romney leaned forward, fingers interlaced on the table, his tone deceptively mild. "Congresswoman, with all due respect, this chamber deals with matters of grave consequence. National security, economic stability. It's kind of decisions that require steady, experienced hands. Do you truly believe your background qualifies? You two sit at this table?" The question, spoken with a veneer of civility, carried the sting of dismissal. It was the language of exclusion dressed in politeness. The suggestion that she was an intruder in a place reserved for the seasoned and the pedigreed. Around the room, the air shifted. Some senators suppressed knowing smiles. Others turned their eyes downward, unwilling to be caught in the theater of humiliation that Romney seemed intent on staging. Staffers scribbled faster, sensing a moment worth recording. Crockett remained motionless. Her stillness was striking, no defensive flinch, no rushed attempt to fill the silence. She folded her hands gently on the table, eyes steady on Romney, refusing to grant him the satisfaction of seeing her rattled. Romney pressed again, leaning into the confidence of a man who had always been answered when he demanded explanation. Because frankly, service at this level is not an internship. It's not a training ground. It's the highest responsibility in the land. Would you agree? A murmur rippled through the chamber. Some interpreted his words as a challenge of principle. Others heard only the condescension dripping from every syllable. A staffer shifted uncomfortably in his seat. Another scribbled notes that would later be parsed in newsrooms. Still, Crockett said nothing. The silence grew heavier, denser. Cameras zoomed closer, capturing the drama in her composure and the faint impatience in Romney's face. Viewers at home felt the tension tightening with each passing second. Was she cornered? Was this the moment the rising congresswoman faltered under the weight of senatorial authority? Romney raised an eyebrow, clearly convinced the silence was his victory. "I simply want to understand," he continued, voice dripping with faux reasonableness, "how your resume, with its focus on local advocacy and courtroom work, prepares you for the scale of issues we face here." Whispers began to snake through the audience. The contrast was stark. One man, leaning on decades of privilege and polish, pressing his advantage as though he were reminding the room of its natural order. One woman, leaning on lived struggle and hard-earned resilience, absorbing the weight of condescension without bending beneath it. For years, questions like these had broken fresh voices, forced them to retreat into rehearsed humility. But Crockett's silence wasn't submission. It was power, building in the pause. She was measuring the weight of every word before she spoke, calculating how to turn his dismissal into her fire. The tension mounted with each heartbeat. Would she fold under the weight of his authority or rise? Romney adjusted his tie, confident. He had boxed her in. His questions still lingered in the chamber, hanging like a trap. Then, finally, Crockett drew in a slow, deliberate breath. Her posture straightened, her eyes locked onto his, unwavering. And when she spoke, her first words cut through the chamber like a blade. For a moment, it seemed as though the chamber itself held its breath, waiting for Jasmine Crockett to speak. Her pause had stretched long enough to turn Romney's smugness into certainty. He believed she was cornered. But what he mistook for hesitation was strategy. And when she finally opened her mouth, the transformation was immediate. "Senator Romney," she began, her tone calm but edged with steel, "I appreciate the question. I really do. Because it says less about me and more about what we choose to value as a nation." Her words landed gently, almost disarmingly, yet the chamber stirred. This was not the nervous ramble Romney expected. This was composure, clarity, and something deeper, the unmistakable confidence of a woman who knew she had the truth on her side. She leaned forward just slightly, her voice steady. "You ask about my experience? Let's talk about that. I didn't inherit a political dynasty. I didn't step into a world already shaped to give me the benefit of the doubt. My experience comes from standing in courtrooms defending people who didn't have a voice. My experience comes from fighting for communities forgotten by those who present them. My experience comes from living the struggles that most Americans face every single day. A low murmur rippled across the chamber. Staffers froze mid-note, realizing this was no ordinary answer. She let the silence sit, then added more pointedly, "That's the kind of experience that doesn't fit neatly on a resume. But tell me, Senator, is it any less real than the kind that comes from boardrooms and campaign war rooms?" Romney's lips pressed into a thin line. His eyes flickered downward for just a second, the faintest crack in his otherwise perfect composure. Crockett noticed and pressed forward. Her voice grew stronger, her rhythm tightening like a preacher at the pulpit. "You question whether my work qualifies me to be here. Yet when I defended the poor against wrongful convictions, that was governance. When I stood with families against corporations that poisoned their neighborhoods, that was governance. When I fought to keep children in classrooms and out of prison pipelines, that was governance. The only difference, Senator, is that my work wasn't done under chandeliers and marble ceilings. It was done in the streets, the courts, and in the communities where government had failed." Gasps and whispers erupted. Some leaned in. Closer, others glanced nervously at Romney. He shifted in his chair, his confident lean now an awkward stiffness. And then Crockett pivoted. "But since we're talking about records, let's talk about yours." The temperature in the room shifted. She was no longer on defense. She was prosecuting. Her eyes locked on him, her tone sharpened with precision. "You've had the privilege of decades in power. You ran corporations, governed a state, ran for president. And yet, tell me, Senator, how much of that time was spent listening to people who didn't look like you, live like you, or pray like you? How much of that time was spent using your position to open doors for those who never had a chance to walk through them?" The audience buzzed like static before a storm. Crockett wasn't just answering the question. She was dismantling the very framework of it. She pressed on, her cadence building. "Experience doesn't just mean years on a calendar. Experience is hardship. Experience is resilience. Experience is being told you don't belong and showing up anyway. Experience is being doubted at every turn and refusing to be silenced." Her eyes scanned the room, then returned to Romney. "That is the kind of experience I bring. And if you can't recognize it, that says less about me and more about the blinders you've worn your entire career." The chamber broke into a wave of hushed murmurs, some hands covering mouths to hide knowing smiles. A few aides stifled laughter, their pens frozen above their notepads. One senator shifted uncomfortably, while another subtly nodded as if to say, "Finally, someone said it." Romney swallowed hard, his face betraying the strain of someone unused to losing control of a narrative. He leaned back, adjusting his tie, his silence louder than any retort he could muster. Crockett let the pause linger, savoring the reversal. Then she delivered the finishing blows with a cadence that could have been carved in stone. "Experience, Senator, isn't about how long you've sat in a chair like this. It's about whether you've carried the weight of the people you claim to represent. It's about whether you fought for them when no one was watching. It's about whether you've had to earn every inch or whether the path was paved. For you," she let each phrase hang, the words echoing in the stillness. She leaned back slightly, her voice softer now, but sharper for it. "So yes, Senator, I do believe I'm qualified, because my qualifications aren't written on paper. They're written in the lives I've fought for. And if that makes you uncomfortable, perhaps it's because it reminds you of how little discomfort you've ever had to face." The chamber was electric. A suppressed laugh bubbled from the back row, quickly stifled. Cameras zoomed tighter, catching Romney's face, jaw clenched, eyes darting, his carefully controlled mask slipping. His silence was no longer power. It was defeat, exposed in front of millions. Meanwhile, in the digital world beyond the chamber, Twitter notifications began to pop like fireworks.
Hashtag.
Ignited clips circulated in real time. Colleagues leaned toward each other with wide eyes. Staffers dared not move, afraid of breaking the spell. It was the kind of moment people would later claim they remembered exactly where they were when it happened.
Oh.
And then came the closing strike. Crockett tilted her head slightly, almost as if offering him one last chance to answer, then delivered the line that sealed the exchange. Senator, you asked me what experience I bring to this table. Let me make it plain. My experience is surviving a world that was never built for me and thriving in it anyway. And that, Senator, is something you will never understand. The words landed like thunder. Romney shifted, lips parting as if to respond, but nothing came. The chamber was silent, except for the faint hum of the cameras, recording every second of his unraveling. And with that, Crockett didn't just answer Romney, she silenced the room. The moment Crockett's final words echoed into silence. The chamber was no longer just a room, it was a stage, and her performance had already begun to ripple far beyond the marble walls. The first tremors came from the phones in the hands of aides and journalists. Quick texts fired off. Tweets launched, clips clipped, and uploaded before the hearing even adjourned. Within minutes, hashtags began to surge. Hashtag Crockett clapback. Hashtag speechless Romney. Hash experience redefined. By the time Crockett left the chamber, her phone was buzzing nonstop. Twitter was a firestorm. Memes appeared at lightning speed. Romney's frozen expression photoshopped onto statues. Captions reading experience, staring into the abyss of silence. Another meme split the screen. One half Romney's dismissive smirk, the other, Crockett's calm, devastating gaze, underlined with the words, "Who really belongs here?" Younger audiences especially flocked to the clips. TikTok flooded with edits, soundtrack to defiant beats. Crockett's words looped over flashing text. Experience is hardship. Experience is resilience. Instagram Reels shared slowed down. Footage of her final blow, overlays reading. She said what we've all been waiting to say. Cable networks scrambled to catch up. On primetime, pundits dissected the exchange. Some called it a masterclass in composure. Others marveled at the precision with which she dismantled Romney's authority. Even those who had never before spoken her name suddenly couldn't stop. One anchor declared this wasn't just a rebuttal. This was a generational shift in power. Late-night comedians wasted no time. Opening monologues featured the clip on loop. One quipped, Mitt Romney asked for her experience, and she gave him a TED Talk on survival. The audience roared. Another joked, Romney went in with questions, came out with an existential crisis. The laughter sealed it. Crockett's words had leaped from the political arena into pop culture. But the most powerful amplification came from the grassroots, community organizers, activists, and everyday Americans who had long felt silenced, now had a rallying cry. Tweets poured in. I've been told my whole life I wasn't qualified. Tonight, Jasmine Crockett spoke for me. A viral Facebook post read, "This isn't about politics. This is about dignity." Reddit threads filled with young people saying they had never felt more seen in American politics. For many, Crockett's moment wasn't just entertaining, it was validating. Two immigrants, women of color, working-class Americans, anyone who had ever been doubted or dismissed, it was proof that their lived experience mattered. She had turned Romney's question into a mirror, reflecting the arrogance of entrenched privilege and the resilience of those who had been forced to fight for every inch. Older viewers, meanwhile, were stunned. Some admired her strength, others bristled at the audacity. But regardless of perspective, no one could deny the resonance. Crockett had forced a conversation that couldn't be ignored. Dinner tables buzzed. Office chatter shifted. Even those who disagreed had to acknowledge something important had happened. As days passed, the clip only grew. Political commentators called it the moment that will define Crockett's career. College students used it in speeches. High school debate coaches replayed it as a lesson in composure under pressure. It transcended the news cycle. It became a cultural marker. Crockett was no longer just a congresswoman. She was a symbol. A fighter who had faced down an elder statesman of American politics and refused to shrink. A voice that carried not only her story, but the weight of millions who had been waiting for someone to speak their truth on a national stage. Yet amid the frenzy, Crockett herself remained composed. In interviews, she didn't gloat. "This was never about me versus Senator Romney," she told one reporter. "It was about reminding people that dignity and resilience are forms of experience too, and those deserve a seat at the table." That humility only deepened her impact. She wasn't just a fighter, she was a vessel, a messenger. The viral memes, the hashtags, the late-night jokes were only the surface. Beneath them was something far more lasting. A reframing of what it meant to be qualified in America. But the real lesson wasn't in the takedown, it was in what Crockett turned it into. When the uproar of the moment settled into memory, Crockett's words lingered like a bell that refused to stop ringing. The beauty of her counterattack wasn't only in how it cut Romney down, it was in how she rebuilt the very idea of what experience means. She had not simply defended herself, she had reframed the battlefield for generations. Experience in politics had been defined narrowly: the length of one's tenure, the pedigree of one's schools, the prestige of one's titles. It was a definition designed to exclude, to keep power in the hands of those who already held it. But Crockett's replies shattered that frame. She reminded America that experience is not only measured in years of elite office, but in years of service, in battles fought when no cameras were rolling. In sacrifices made for communities that history tried to forget, her voice carried a truth that transcended the chamber. Experience is surviving when others said you wouldn't. Experience is standing up to systems that tried to push you down. Experience is looking power in the eye, hearing it say you're not enough, and answering, "Watch me." That was the universal lesson that night. Dignity is greater than arrogance. If struggle outweighs privileged dismissal. For every person who had ever been underestimated, Crockett's words became a mirror, reflecting back their worth, their fight, their belonging, in living rooms across the country. Daughters turned to mothers, saying, "She's talking about us." Immigrants felt the echo of their own sacrifices in her defiance. Workers, activists, teachers, all those who had ever been told their experience didn't count, suddenly saw themselves in her. It wasn't just a rebuttal, it was a reclamation. Crockett's moment reminded the nation that true authority doesn't come from the comfort of privilege, it comes from the crucible of struggle, it comes from the willingness to serve, not just to preside. And that is why her silence before the storm had been so powerful. It wasn't hesitation, it was history. Gathering its strength before speaking, Romney's silence in the aftermath was more than personal defeat. It was symbolic, the silence of old assumptions. The silence of doors that had long been shut finally cracking open. The silence of arrogance retreating before dignity. And in that silence, millions heard something louder than words. A shift, a turning point. Proof that the weight of lived experience could silence even the most polished voice of privilege. Every generation has its moments of reckoning. When power is forced to confront the truth it has long tried to ignore. For many, this was one of them. Crockett didn't just silence a senator, she spoke for the underestimated everywhere. And in that moment, silence wasn't just Romney's, it was history's. Romney questioned her experience. Her response left him and the country speechless. That single exchange transformed from a clash of egos into a revelation of truth. It wasn't just about Crockett defending herself. It was about redefining what it means to lead, to serve, to carry the weight of a people's story into the halls of power. Her courage in that chamber was more than a comeback, it was a lesson. In a world that still tries to measure worth by privilege, by tenure, by old-world status, she reminded us that courage, authenticity, and lived struggle will always triumph. Arrogance fades, dismissal crumbles, but dignity endures. That is why this moment matters, because it tells every voice that has ever been doubted, ignored, or underestimated. You are enough. Your story counts. And when you speak with truth, even the most powerful will be forced into silence. So here's where you come in. If you believe voices like Jasmine Crockett's are not just important, but essential for America's future, don't let this story end here. share it, amplify it. Let others feel the same fire you felt in this moment. And if you want to keep standing in these moments of reckoning, if you want to witness the clapbacks, the courage, and the history unfolding, subscribe. Stay part of this movement. Because what you just saw is only the beginning. The fight for dignity, truth, and representation is far from over. And every time someone like Crockett speaks, the balance of power shifts just a little more toward justice. History isn't written only by those who hold the gavel. It's written by those bold enough to answer back.